All right, so here we are. Hi everyone, welcome to this week's Out of the Archives. I'm Jonah Lacqua, I'm Executive Director of the History Project. We are Boston's LGBTQ community archives. And this is our series where basically we're trying to recreate sort of a virtual community conversation via Zoom. So it's so lovely to see so many of you here and to see so many faces and partners and animals and everything else in your living room. For those of you who are new to this series or new to the History Project, we are Boston's LGBTQ community archives, and that means that we collect, preserve, and share LGBTQ history about Boston. And if you're from Boston, you know that means Boston and Provincetown and New England, really. While we are socially distanced and can't get into the archives, we launched a project called #QueerArchivesAtHome. So if you are at home, surrounded by your things, I would ask you to look around you, see what you've hung on to that tells part of your story, and please submit it to this Queer Archives at Home project. So open your closets, open your boxes, go up into your attic if it's not too hot yet, and pull down something that you've hung on to that tells your story so that we can all sort of experience that together during this time. Also, again, while we are so happy to be able to share LGBTQ history during this time of social distancing, if you can help us to achieve our mission, please consider making a donation today. If you've already made a donation, thank you. If you'd like to make another donation, thank you again. Or pick up some swag from our new store. I'll put the link in the chat. You can check that out. We've invigorated some bar logos from a variety of Boston bars. And all those proceeds go to help us achieve our mission. And with that, that's my whole spiel. I'd like to introduce Dee Michel. Dee will be talking tonight about Judy, Oz, and the Judy, Oz, and the Gay Connect. So I don't have my notes.
Need for a shared history.
Here we go, guys. We're all live, and I meant to have the bio pulled up and ready to go. So thank you for bearing with me. So Dee Michel, who is author of Friends of Dorothy, Why Gay Boys and Gay Men Love the Wizard of Oz, has given many talks on the Oz-Gay connection. He'll be giving a talk to us tonight. He served as a volunteer at Gay Community News and was the first male co-chair of the Gay Task Force of the American Library Association. And so tonight's talk is called Judy, Oz, and the Need for a Shared History. And with that, I turn it over to you, Dee. And here, I'll open your PowerPoint. Alrighty.
Oops.
From the beginning. There we go.
Okay. This is a painting by Michael Bryett, and I'll talk a little bit more about it at the very end. Let's go to the next slide, please. Joan is doing the slides for me from her end. So my father, Martin Michel, was gay. On the right, you see him showing off his muscles in front of our house on Fire Island. That up at the top of the dunes was the place. We had a summer house there. It's Ocean Bay Park, not one of the gay areas. But Dad was gay, and that's me on the left in blonde. My brother, who was a year older but a little smaller, my brother Guy is on the right in the red shirt. Next one. This is a picture of Dad. That was back in the 50s. This is my father in the 70s. It proves he's gay. So the interesting thing about my father is that he had treasured Oz books when he was a kid. Next slide, please. And so he loved these books and put his names in them. You can see in pencil, it says Martin Michel, Glendon Terrace, Newark, New Jersey. And then he read these books as bedtime stories to both me and my brother Guy, and I was the one who was more interested in Oz and kept the books in my room and put my name over his. That's just one example. And my brother sort of went on to be sort of interested in science fiction, Isaac Asimov, guns and rockets, and me being the gay son was more interested in fairyland, fantasy, Wizard of Oz, Lord of the Rings, that kind of thing. When I was I had joined the Wizard of Oz Club briefly when I was a kid, and then when I was in Wisconsin, oh my goodness, Harry, was in Wisconsin, and I found out that in Delavan there was a convention of the International Wizard of Oz Club in 1998. I went to this convention and I was surprised by how many gay men were there. The Oz Club was more focused on the Oz books by Baum, which rather than the MGM movie. I knew that the movie was a big deal in gay circles. I didn't know that there were lots of other gay Oz fans who were into the books until I went to this convention. And I asked somebody there, has anybody ever written about the Oz Gay Connection for the Journal of the Oz Club? And they said, oh no, that would raise a few eyebrows. And being the good gay activist that I am, I thought it would be good to raise some eyebrows. So they had announced the big convention in 2000 was the centenary 100-year anniversary of the original publication of the original Oz book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, by L. Frank Baum. So I thought that gave me 2 years to write something. And what I did for research was sort of compare themes in Oz and themes in gay lives, and figuring maybe that if there was something that resonated with gay men, that was why they were into Oz. So I gave the presentation. It was a big success. Lots of standing room only gay and straight people there, and it was really fun. And at that point, I had more material than I could make into an article or a speech. And so I decided to make a book out of it. And here's the next slide, please. Joan, next slide. Oh, there we go, thanks. So this is the book that happened just a few years ago in 2018. I was actually working on it for 20 years. But I realized if I was going to be making claims about how gay men are responding to Oz, I really should talk to them and not just have it be my own research. So I developed a questionnaire and had it filled out by over 100 gay male Oz fans. A couple of people identified as queer or bi, but basically they call themselves gay. And one thing that came out of it, I asked them what their favorite version of the story was. And some people said the MGM movie, some people said a particular Oz book, Wicked, Oz on Ice. There were other versions that they encountered first or might have loved more. And one thing that was really amazing that I did not expect at all in the questionnaires, I asked when people first became fans of Oz stories in one version or the other. And almost without exception, it was very young. We're talking like 3, 4, 5 years old is when pre-gay boys or gay boys, whatever you want to call them, were into Oz. It was way before they were adults and might have heard about it, the MGM movie, through gay culture. Next slide, please. So here's the way the book is organized. I've got a section about gay fans that sort of lays out some of my assumptions and evidence for the connection. Then part 2 is really the meat of the book, and or the tofu of the book, and that's based on the questionnaires. I look at the different themes that come up in individual lives. Part 3 is about the social and cultural contexts, talking more about the MGM movie in gay culture. And so today, since the chapter that has the most historical stuff in it is chapter 9, Oz and Judy in Gay Folklore. So I'm basing my talk today on chapter 9.
I'll leave the room if you want.
Sorry?
Listen to this. This is...
Somebody should turn off their microphone. Next slide, please. So Oz imagery from the MGM movie shows up in a lot of gay contexts. This is from 9 years ago. The Spooky Bear folks in P-Town had this advertisement. And in 2000, next slide, in 2003, Manchester hosted the Euro Pride Gay Pride March, the European-wide Pride March that gets shuttled around to different cities each year. And this was taken in Manchester in 2003. And I actually knew the partner of the guy who took the photo, so I got permission to use it. Now, one more slide. We have another example of Judy being part of the Oz thing. And this is a card, and on the inside it says, Toto, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore. And one more piece of evidence of the Judy Oz connection. This is from the New Yorker in 1998. And the interesting thing about this cartoon is that the New Yorker isn't geared particularly towards gay men, I don't think. So the idea is that you'd only get the joke if you know that Judy is a gay icon and Oz is the MGM movie with starring Judy Garland in 1939 is sort of beloved of gay men. And one explicit statement about this came in 1994, next slide, from Ben Bradley in the New York Times. This is was written during Stonewall 25, and there were a lot of theater events, and a couple of them had to do with Judy Garland and The Wizard of Oz. So Ben Bradley wrote this article as part of the end of June 28th, during this 25th anniversary of Pride, Stonewall 25. There's some unsubstantiated claims here that, whoops, I didn't say to go to the next one. We're still on the previous one, please. So yeah, there's some things he says here that may or may not really be true, but it's the New York Times, it's in print, it's gotta be true. Okay, so now Joan, thanks. So there are four related beliefs that I've found a lot of people hold. One is that gay men love the movie because of Judy Garland, and that the expression Friends of Dorothy refers to Judy. It's slang for gay men, that's undisputed, but this other belief is that it's been used as gay slang since the 1950s. Notice Brantley said at least 5 decades, and that the gay people used it in the military. Also, the idea that gay grief over Judy's death and funeral caused the Stonewall riots to happen. They did occur. The first night of the riots was the night of the funeral, which is pretty amazing. And finally, many people think that the rainbow was chosen as a symbol of gay pride because of the song Over the Rainbow. So these are all sort of interrelated things. Three out of, well, they're all about Judy insofar as Judy sang Over the Rainbow. And they're related to The Wizard of Oz, the MGM movie. So we can turn these into questions, next slide, and ask, is Judy the main reason gay men love the film? What is the origin of the phrase? Did gay grief really spark the riots? And how is the rainbow related to Over the Rainbow? So I'm gonna look at the evidence for each of these 4 things. Let's go to Judy first. That's later in the 60s. Okay, next slide. So there are 4 reasons why Judy can't really explain gay love of Oz in general, and even of the film. The first is, as I mentioned, it's really, really young kids who become enamored of Oz, quite often the MGM movie, when they first see it when they're 3 or 4 or 5. So of my 100 and so questionnaires, most of them were boomers, but I had some people who were younger. When they filled it out, they were in their 20s in 2000, 2002, 2005. And some people who were older than boomers. But a lot of people talked about watching the movie as an annual ritual in the 60s when it was on TV before you could get things on video. So really early loved by kids is one point. Also, because you can't really distinguish movie fans from other fans. If you're a fan of the books, obviously it's not because of Judy, unless you got in through the movie and then became more fans of the books for their own sake. Relatively few people mentioned Judy in my questionnaires. Some people did, of course, and but not a lot. And one of the questions I asked in the questionnaire was, what are your other favorite movies? And hardly any other Judy movies were mentioned. I mean, dozens and dozens of movies were mentioned, from All About Eve to Star Trek. And if Judy was really a big determinant, then you'd think that other movies, if these were all real diehard Judy fans, then they'd also list other movies by Judy. And they didn't, by and large. Not by Judy, that Judy starred in. 1 or 2 people did mention Star is Born, but not Meet Me in St. Louis or whatever. And again, if it was Judy fandom was such a big thing, then you'd get bars like Meet Me in St. Louis or The Boy Next Door. You don't, but you still get lots of bars named Oz or Over the Rainbow or whatever. And finally, the deeper reason, these are sort of superficial things, but the deeper reason is that their themes in the Oz stories would appeal to young gay boys, such as escape and fantasy, gender roles, being different, being accepted for being different. These are the kinds of things that really resonate with the young gay boys. So even though many people think that Judy is the main reason, and when I tell people about my research, they often say, oh, it's just Judy, as if that somehow isn't in a dismissive way. So no, Judy is not the cause of gay love of Oz. Next slide. Friend of Dorothy. So there are several people have mentioned or nominated several different candidates for the Dorothy that's in the expression Friend of Dorothy. And Judy, the next slide, Judy is certainly one of them. And she was a gay icon probably in the 50s, as far as we can tell, more than a decade after she starred in the movie. One nice thing about this theory is that her companions are all non-traditional masculinity types. So if a Friend of Dorothy could refer to her companions, the Tin Woodman, the Scarecrow, and the Cowardly Lion, as metaphors for gay people. Another theory, though, is that it's really Dorothy Parker. Next slide. And many gay men admired Parker's bitchy and clever remarks and her writing. There's documented evidence of that. And also, she did spend a lot of time around gay men, both in the 30s in New York City and in the 60s in LA. I read a couple of biographies of her just to find out more about her. And gay men would have been aware of her genius, in terms of her writing and her bitchiness in the 30s. She was publishing poems and short stories then, and a member of the Algonquin Round Table. And she married, her other gay bona fides was that she married Alan Campbell, a gay man, twice. They divorced and then got married again. So that's a possible Dorothy to be a friend of. Another person is Dorothy Dean. Next slide. She was a well-connected woman who preferred the company of gay men when she was a student in Cambridge in the 50s, Cambridge, Mass. And then she participated in the New York City literary and art world from 1962 to 1980. She did write about gay film in something called the All Lavender Cinema Courier that began in 1975. And this picture is from a New Yorker article about her that was published in 1995. Now notice the title says Downtown Chronicles, Friends of Dorothy, but the author of the article, Hinton Alls, never suggests in the article that Dorothy Dean gave rise to the phrase. I think the reason why people nominate Dorothy Dean is just because of the title of this article, because she had a salon and a lot of gay men gathered around her. But as I say, the article doesn't suggest that. It's just in the title that an editor, probably not Hilton Alls himself, assigned that phrase to. Another Dorothy is Dorothy King. One or two people have mentioned her. She was a London socialite in the early 20th century in London, obviously. And she held soirees where, quote, gay men could dance, sing, play charades, and generally have a gay old time. Pretty soon, these officers began to identify other like-minded chaps by asking others, is he musical and or is he a friend of Dorothy's? So somebody did write that, and I've got citations for all these things. In my book, there are hundreds, dozens of pages of footnotes. So she's been nominated, Dorothy King, by a few people. I couldn't get a picture of her. And finally, there's one other theory that it has to do with L. Frank Baum's writing himself. In his fifth Oz book, The Road to Oz, which was published in 1909, Polychrome, the character on the left, is the daughter of the rainbow. And she meets Dorothy's friends, the Hungry Tiger and the Cowardly Lion, about 2/3 of the way through the book. And she says to Dorothy, quote, you have some queer friends, Dorothy. And Dorothy responds, quote, the queerness doesn't matter so long as they're friends. So a couple of people have thought that this is sort of the locus of the Friend of Dorothy. This is where the origin of the expression comes from, this passage in the fifth Oz book. And one linguist pointed out to me that there doesn't have to be a particular Dorothy that the expression refers to. It's sort of a funny idea, but the example that Arnold Zwicky gave me was drunk as Cooter Brown, which is an expression apparently, and there isn't any particular Cooter Brown, he is sure, it's just an expression. So maybe friend of Dorothy is an expression without a Dorothy, particular Dorothy that's being referred to. Okay, let me just pause, slow down, and let people think about these different theories for a second. So one way I thought that I might be able to decide among these competing theories is to try to figure out when the expression first was used. You know, if it was used before the 39 movie, then presumably that would make one of the other Dorothys, not Judy Garland, a more likely candidate. If it was way after the movie, then who knows? So, so I did a huge amount of research. I was a linguistics undergraduate major. I've got a PhD in library science. So the idea of hunting down origin of a slang expression was something I could obsess over. Now, so next slide. So these are sources that did have Friend of Dorothy listed, and they're from the 1990s and later. And some of them cite the MGM Wizard and some of them don't. So there are general dictionaries, slang dictionaries, and even some gay slang dictionaries, again, all from the 90s. And there are a lot of mentions in the gay press and in popular culture from the 90s and later. And there's one empirically based collection of gay slang where the guy actually interviewed people and talked to them. It's called Fantabulosa. It's in there from 2002. And the Oxford English Dictionary cites a source from 1985, but there's a mistake. The source that they cite doesn't exist. If anybody's interested more in that, I can, I talked to reference librarians and again, did a lot of research, just trying to track down what it was they thought that they were citing. So I can give you information about that afterwards or in email if you want. Okay, so the next slide has a lot of information about sources that don't mention Friends of Dorothy. Now I came up with 11 lists of gay slang. The first one was created in 1941. The most recent was 1988. It's not listed in any of these. And Friend of Dorothy, the expression. And I found 7 academic empirical research studies from 1965 to 1985. And again, none of them mentioned Friend of Dorothy. And one of them interviewed a bunch of gay men, the researcher, and asked for synonyms for gay men. And you came up with things like poofter and fudge packer and things that I had never even heard of. And there were dozens and dozens of synonyms, but Friend of Dorothy was not one of them that anybody offered in any of these studies. Now, you can't really prove a negative. If something isn't there, that doesn't prove that it wasn't around. I just think that these are pretty amazing. And there were 4 academic discussions of gay codes and coded language that I found from 1976 to 1996. Again, Friend of Dorothy was not mentioned in any of these. So if Friend of Dorothy really was used in the 50s and 60s and 70s, there's no documentation of it. I talked to people who did research in gay archives and had them keep their eyes open, for diaries or letters. If somebody wrote it down in their diary and said, oh, I just went to this fabulous party and Freddie was so hot, I wonder if he's a friend of Dorothy or not, that would be really, really cool. A couple of people have said that they have heard that it was used then or were around people who used it, but I haven't been able to track them down or find anything in print. So the important point, I think, here is that there's no evidence of use before Stonewall. It's all after there's been a gay press that's developed and people can share stuff in a more open way. But I think the interesting thing is that whether or not Judy's portrayal of Dorothy Gale in the MGM movie, in fact, is the origin of the phrase, so many people think it is significant. Next, we're up to belief number 3. Next slide. Judy's relationship between Judy's funeral and the Stonewall riots. On the left, you've got the crowd scene at the funeral parlor, and on the right is a scene from people throwing rocks at the Stonewall either that night or the next 2 nights. I can't verify that that was the first night, the same night that the funeral took place, but the riot did start that day. Now, many people associate the funeral sort of as a backdrop of the police raid, and what Ben Brantley said is that it probably helped provoke the riots. Some claim a direct cause. One of the co-founders of the Stonewall Veterans Association, Jeremiah Newton, says on camera in 1999, quote, "I was at the riots, Judy had a part in it, she was in our minds, she was in our hearts, she was in our souls." The thing is, historians discount this. First of all, they say that the rioting younger adults and kids were the wrong generation. They weren't sweater-wearing Judy Garland lovers. They were much more likely to be into Motown and rock in 1969. The other thing that historians point out, specifically Douglas Carter in his book about Stonewall, went through a lot of contemporary accounts of the riots, and none of them mention the funeral of Judy Garland. And you think that this was sort of in the air and part of what was going on, somebody when writing in the Village Voice or elsewhere would have said something about that. So again, it's negative, which doesn't prove anything. But it's just sort of indirect, circumstantial, non-evidence. I think some people talk about it more as a metaphor for change. Peter Russo wrote that he was a big Judy Garland fan, and it was active both before and after Stonewall. And he said that Judy stood for the old gay world and the riots sort of began a new world. He doesn't claim that her funeral caused the riots, but that there is a relationship in terms of the metaphor. So what a lot of people say is legend has it that the gay grief at the funeral boiled over in the frustration that night. Well, why that night? Who knows? It's a nice story that it has to be true, is what people think. Finally, number 4, the rainbow flag. Over the rainbow is a famous expression of longing to leave a hostile environment. And people have called it a gay anthem and a theme song. And Holly Near sang Over the Rainbow at the 1979 March on Washington. And in her albums from the late 70s, she talks about being a friend of Dorothy herself. And I corresponded with her briefly. She was one of the few famous people who wrote me back directly. And I also got in touch with Gilbert Baker, who designed the rainbow flag in 1978 for the San Francisco Pride Parade. And he said he didn't have Over the Rainbow in mind when he designed it. He never, in his writings about the flag, he never talks about Oz. He mentions that the colors in the flag stand for diversity, and each one had a particular meaning. Some of them had spiritual meanings for him. So I talked to him on the phone before he died, and he said, no, not true. So for some things we really don't know, like Friend of Dorothy. For others, it's pretty clear that it's not true, like Judy is a cause of the gay love and the rainbow flag one. So let's step back for a second and think, if these beliefs are not true, what's going on? So in culture, generally, culture is passed along through the family, but gay culture can't do that for the most part. We don't, unlike my father, who actually didn't give me any gay culture really. Even when you do have gay parents, gay culture is usually not passed down through your family. So how do you get it? It's sort of, in the old days, before there was an out gay media, it was really friendship circles is how you learned about things. So one gay man, pre-Stonewall, knew about the expression Friend of Dorothy. Presumably he used it to other people who didn't know it, and then explained to them what it meant. You have mentors, sometimes they're older, not necessarily, who tell you things about gay culture. After Stonewall, you can also learn about culture through printed media. Books, there are all sorts of compendiums and guides to gay culture and articles in the lesbian, gay, and queer press. So that's sort of gay culture. And if you think about folklore, it's passed along in traditional societies. Folklore is passed along without the use of writing, and it may or may not be true. And it develops, expresses, and maintains what one anthropologist called social bonds that create the group. That's the meaning, or rather the function of folklore, to create social bonds in a group. And modern urban folklore, as I mentioned, can get passed along both verbally, and it can be given additional credence by appearing in print. And the way bits of folklore would work is that one person would come up with something like a joke and tell another person, and it would, if it resonates and catches on, the joke would spread and become widely known. Obviously, there are probably a lot more jokes that were told to one friend that never get farther than the one other person. You can imagine a network with people connecting, and some things go very far and some don't, depending on how they resonate and how people like them. It sort of takes some fertile soil or it doesn't. And then once folklore gets institutionalized, it gets passed on purpose, and which is sort of outside of the traditional folk processes. So let's look at these four beliefs again. Next chart. Keeping in mind what I just sort of said about folklore and culture. So these are aspects of gay culture. Judy is or was a gay icon. Friend of Dorothy is slang for gay men. These things are undisputed. Gay men and others fought police at the Stonewall Inn the night of Judy's funeral. Probably was drag queens who may have thrown the first stone. And Over the Rainbow speaks to gay men, and the rainbow flag is a gay symbol. These are pretty much undisputed claims that are aspects of gay culture. Now the next slide adds what I'm calling folkloric beliefs. Whoops, no, that was Joan, back up. Yeah, looks like the same one that I cleverly filled in the right-hand column. So the folkloric belief associated with this aspect of gay culture, number one, is that Judy is the reason gay men love the film. The folkloric belief about Friend of Dorothy is that Friend of Dorothy was used as far back as the 50s, and it refers to Judy's character, Dorothy Gale. And the folkloric belief about the Stonewall is that gay grief over the death of Judy gave rise to the riots. And finally, the folkloric belief that I'm saying is associated with this aspect of gay culture, the rainbow flag, is that the rainbow was chosen because of Over the Rainbow. So I came up with this term folkloric belief. It seems to me sort of to capture what's going on. There are individual beliefs that may or may not be true. They're passed around through gay culture. So now I just want to end with some sort of functions, thinking about what these beliefs can do for us. Next slide now. And they really fulfill mythic needs. I've read a lot as part of my reading on Joseph Campbell and other people talking about myths and why myths are important, and how you can create your own personal mythology. There's sort of spiritual books about that. And I boiled down the four mythic needs to belonging, identity, history, and integration. So belonging means that when you buy into a myth in old-fashioned culture, or a folkloric belief in this case, you find yourself being connected to something larger than yourself. And gay boys who were isolated growing up and think that they're the only ones like themselves want to feel that they belong to something larger than themselves. So that's the need, that if you believe these four things, you are sort of part of gay culture that's larger than yourself. And related to that is the idea of identity. If you're part of a group, it reinforces your identity. You have these beliefs that are shared by the larger culture. And in terms of history, these four beliefs, I think they become sort of myths or legends of gay history. And together they manufacture a shared gay history. If we believe these things, then we all have this history. It's not just us being gay at in this moment, but we can talk about Friend of Dorothy being used by people back in the 50s, or in 1969, gay grief is what sparked the Stonewall riots and makes us feel a part of this history. And the most interesting thing about the four beliefs is that many traditional myths are origin stories, and 3 of the 5 beliefs are in effect stories of origin. Garland's funeral causing the Stonewall riots, her role is the origin of the expression Friend of Dorothy, and Over the Rainbow was the inspiration for the gay pride flag. Now, they're not full narratives the way you believe, a traditional myth might be about the creation of the world. It's more like a little short, teeny mini plot that are about the origins of important aspects of gay culture. But they ground us by explaining aspects of our culture. And finally, in terms of integration, the individual beliefs give us a sense of history, origins, and identity. And they put parts of gay culture on separate pedestals. But what's neat about the fact that these 5 interlocking things is that they all have common threads. They're all related to Judy and the MGM movie. And it's sort of neater, simpler, and aesthetically pleasing to tie things together in this way. And they reinforce each other. What I say is that these beliefs reinforce each other as part of a network of interrelated knowledge, all relating to Judy and the MGM movie. And people have written about Oz as a myth, or an American myth. And so the mythic Oz story is a perfect peg to tag all these needs on: the belonging, identity, history, and integration. It's sort of satisfying, I think, to have one related set of explanations for diverse phenomena. And even those gay men who are not fans of Oz find comfort in gay love of Oz. So let's look at the final slide now. So we're back at the Bryett painting. Given their suits and ties and hats, this is probably taking place in a mythical 1940s, or perhaps 39. And you'll note that the name of it is Once in a Lullaby, and the name of the theater where this movie is being shown is the Rainbow. And this is what is so nice about this is it's sort of like a rose-colored version of gay history. It's very unlikely that 2 gay men would be kissing in front of the Wizard of Oz in a movie theater in public in 1940 or the early 40s, but it sort of captures all a lot of what I've been trying to say about why Oz gives us a shared history. So it's not even 20 of, and I'd love to hear reactions and questions. I'm done.
Thank you. Thank you, Dee. I'm pulling down the slideshow. I'm getting my things in order. So we have a couple of questions from the chat, and then I thought of a couple of questions too. And I just want to point out that I think it's really interesting that you ended with this image that is sort of myth-making in the same way we were talking before the chat about I'm from Plymouth, Massachusetts, home of the Pilgrims. And we have a lot of that kind of myth-making, like, the rock and the Mayflower and these symbols that get used as part of a larger American culture and heritage. But you're talking about the same thing here on a different scale and with a different community. But it's a very similar sort of idealized version of history that we're thinking of or looking at. So
so it's sort of, you want to think, well, whose needs does that serve, these particular myths? That's what I tried to do.
So we already have actually 2 questions of people who raised their hands. So I will click on Chris L. I'm going to unmute you and lower your hand if you'd like to ask your question first.
I saw him before.
Chris was here. All right, we'll move on to, oh, Chris, there you are. Oh,
can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I had kind of an odd question. That was the first time I ever heard the term Friends of Dorothy used. It was in relation to, and I'll back up a second and say it was interesting hearing about this, kind of the way you'd announce going into a gay bar yourself. First time I ever heard used was in a relationship to cruise ships. And I don't know whether it was just, word was put around the ship or was actually on the schedule somewhere, but it'd usually be like the LGBT group would meet at some bar in some afternoon and that would be it. It'd be like on a normal cruise, so not a special.
Yeah.
Did you ever read anything about that?
Yeah. People have talked about that. It was in the 80s and 90s, more likely, when you had gay people going on mainstream cruises and wanting to meet. And it was sort of the code. Friends of Dorothy were meeting, but they weren't out enough to say gay group. And some people in that context say it's sort of parallel to Friends of Bill, which was a way of saying that you're in AA without having to out yourself as an alcoholic or associated with Alcoholics Anonymous. So some people think that Friends of Dorothy was specifically modeled on the syntax of Friends of Bill. And often at the cruise ships, you'd have Friends of Bill also meeting. So that was certainly one of the uses of it. There's even Friends of Dorothy Cruises or Dorothy Cruises or something in San Francisco that isn't around anymore, but I tried to get in touch with the folks who had that cruise line.
Thanks.
Great. So we have a question from Stephen. Stephen, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes, done. Hi. I wonder if you think that the recent film Judy resuscitates or revives the Judy legend. We saw it in York, England, and at least a third, maybe more of the audience were gay men. And not necessarily all of a certain vintage either.
Yeah, well, there's actually been a lot of writing more like 10 to 15 years ago about the death of Judy and the death of the gay icon and the death of the diva. Interesting that, well, yeah, certainly the Renee Zellweger, I haven't seen it, I can never pronounce her last name, but it got good notices and she got an Oscar for it. Whether that sort of revives Judy as a gay icon, I have no idea. She gave an oblique nod to, I saw a quote from her about acknowledging heroes and everybody needing heroes in these tough times, sort of obliquely talking about perhaps Judy as a gay icon to gay men. It was a little indirect, but I saw that quote in a gay paper somewhere, I think from San Diego or Palm Springs.
So we have two questions in the chat from Charles. And I'm going to ask, they're sort of related. One of them is about Liza Minnelli and Peter Allen, who had the show The Boy from Oz. And we're wondering if you have any thoughts on Peter Allen specifically. And then also there's a quote from one of the Oz books where the Cowardly Lion remarks, "Any friend of Dorothy must be our friends as well." And which Charles cites from the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Heritage. And if that came up in your research. And
yeah. What was the first one? I forgot already. Oh, Peter Allen. Yeah. Right. The Boy from Oz was almost a one-man show. It was about the life of Peter Allen, and it was on Broadway with Hugh Jackman, and Liza Minnelli has a small role in it, and she was attracted to gay men. Judy also married a couple of gay men in there. Vincent Minnelli was bisexual or gay, and one or two of her other husbands. There were certainly a lot of gay people associated with the film. The question isn't about that, so I won't go into that. But some people have evidence that, or claim that Judy was involved with her publicity person. And the woman who wrote Eloise K. Thompson was also worked for MGM, and some people think that she was involved with K. Thompson at some point. So both Judy and Liza certainly hung out with gay men and had love relationships with them. And Liza Minnelli is also in a gay icon into musicals, who's an over the top, very dramatic, emotional type. What was the other one?
About the quotes from the Cowardly Lion.
Oh, yeah. I got in touch with that guy, the Smithsonian guy. You'll see a pattern here, like Dee tracks people down. I don't think that that's actually a quote in one of the Oz books, but I remember writing to him and sort of being frustrated that he didn't really document stuff as well as I had hoped he would. I don't think I wrote him about that particular claim, but there was something else about the whole exhibit that I wondered about. But I can, whoever that is, if you email me, I can go into more detail. Should I just say my email address? Is that best way to do that? Yeah.
Yeah,
Or you can send a link to it. It's deemichel@comcast.net.
Yeah,
I saw a question up about white and race stuff. Are you going to ask that next?
so that's exactly what I was going to ask.
Yeah.
Is it the connection that you're thinking about here? Is it predominantly white gay male? My question was, is there a lesbian or woman equivalent that you can think of? But yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I talk a fair amount in that first chapter about the demographics of my study, and I did get a handful of African-American gay Oz fans who filled out the questionnaire. Some of them talk about the Wiz being more important to them, and who was it? Billy Porter, who's since become famous for Pose, and before that he was on Broadway in Kinky Boots. He was interviewed in some gay culture lavender film documentary and said that Paris is Burning was his Oz, that was the movie that really got him going the way for some people Wizard of Oz did. So it's sort of like urban gay male culture in general is basically white, and that's where a lot of the stuff comes from. In terms of Judy and the MGM movie, the individual responses, I think, are more spread out. There was one guy who I talked to after he was written. He was a black guy who in Colorado or Utah, and he staged the Wizard of Oz musical, and he thought that the end, back to the black and white set, was not as colorful as it could be. So he had people bring out rainbow flags at the end. And he says that he wasn't thinking of rainbow flags as a gay thing. He just wanted to make it look more visually interesting. But some people objected so much, and the board of the community theater wanted him to take them down. He ended up quitting. He was so upset about it, but he still loves Oz. And I talked to him on the phone at great length. So for him, there was a personal connection. And some people have written about The Wiz, which the film is not very good, most people think. But the stage version of The Wiz is closer to the book, and that Dorothy is younger. In the movie, Diana Ross is a school teacher, and she's in her 20s. But the stage version of The Wiz, some people in my questions, like, that was their favorite version. And that certainly speaks to Black people. And people of color have written about The Wiz being that version of Oz that they like the most. In terms of women, I do have a handful of lesbian uses of Oz. There's some neat erotic poetry by a lesbian in Milwaukee about ruby slippers between my thighs and all this stuff. And I wrote to her and I wanted to know more about her feelings, and she didn't write back. And I think she was probably a separatist and thought, what does this guy care about? I'm not going to talk to him, which is too bad, but understandable. And I have this bibliography of lesbian uses of Oz used in lesbian context. Part of the problem is that women have less access to money, and so, in general, gay men are much more visible in Hollywood or employed, even if they're not visible, than women are. Whether there's some other comparable thing in other cultures, other countries, as well as for women and non-white men, is a really good question. I haven't seen any. And when people ask me, what about straight people? Aren't straight people into Oz too? And I say, well, I think a better comparison would be with another minority. So if you looked at, because the MGM movie is in fact, got famous in culture as a whole, mainstream US culture as a whole. But if you look at, say the deaf community, you could look at deaf newspapers and novels written by deaf and hearing impaired people and see the kind of imagery. And I'm pretty sure that Oz doesn't show up much the way it does in gay press or in gay literature. A lot of my questionnaire people I actually got because they were gay novelists who used Oz in their writing, like William Mann and so on. So I think if you compare it to another minority, I mean, and then the research would then be, well, what is there a particular touchstone or story or mythic set of beliefs that works for them? It'll be someone else's research project. But I do apologize that race was an invisible category for me as a white person, and it didn't occur to me to ask that in the questionnaire. And I've got their date of birth and all sorts of other things. I happened to find out that Jesse and some of the other people were Black, but you know, stupid me for not asking that.
Part of the follow-up.
Right, or I shouldn't say stupid, I should say unintentionally racist, because that's part of the culture that I'm in.
So we have a couple of questions in the chat, and if folks want to ask questions, please feel free to hit the hand raise button or let me know in the chat that you want to talk out loud and I'll call on you. But one question we got is, why do you think Judy Garland resonates so strongly with gay men?
Well, that's definitely more of an era than Oz is. Nobody's written about Oz being dead, but people have written about Judy. And there are some good articles. There was Michael Bronski's written about the appeal of Judy. And Richard Dyer, a gay film critic in England, wrote this amazing chapter of a book where he actually did a little empirical research and came up with synthesized certain themes when he asked people why they were into Judy. And there was the things about her wearing her emotions on her sleeve, her being resilient. After her suicide attempt, she bounced back into her concerts. And unlike some other strong women icons like Betty Davis or Katharine Hepburn, Judy was really up and down in terms of her career. Well, Katharine Hepburn and Betty Davis were up and down in terms of their careers, but in terms of sort of her emotions, like, you know, she really let it all hang out. When she was upset or she was late or drunk, people saw that in her concerts. And I think her emotionality is something that gay men of a certain era related to. And her, you know, her talent. I'm not a Judy art big expert or fan. I've, you know, read stuff, so I could be on top of things. But I can. If people are interested, again, I can send. The Richard Dyer article is really good, and Michael Bronski too has written about it very thoughtfully.
Excellent. So we have a comment in the chat about a 1993 event in Provincetown where the actors who played the Munchkins went to Provincetown. Have you heard of this?
No. I've seen them at Oz conventions, but I didn't know that they were in P-Town. And sometimes the carnival parade where people dress up, there are often a lot of Oz people in Oz costumes in P-Town. I've got some great pictures from that. But no, I didn't know about the actors playing the Munchkins. None of them are around anymore. Was this person there? Can you say any more about? Did they take pictures, or people sign things for people? Or?
Yeah, they're asking if anyone remembered Munchkin Day in 1993. Do we have any other questions from the group? If anyone would like me to?
I saw chat stuff about folklore and etymology and stuff.
Yeah, sort of about the term false etymology or folk etymology. And I think the sort of question that came out of that conversation happening in the chat is, do you think that based on the research that you've done, that this might be an example of a false etymology, that now we associate the term with different iterations of Judy's and Dorothy's and Oz, but in reality, there's not one touchstone, maybe? It might be the question there.
Let's see. All right. Well, folk etymology, I'm trying to think, a good example of that is sparrowgrass. I think it's in Florida. That's what people call asparagus. And folk etymology is when you hear something and you change, it sounds like some words that make more sense to you. So asparagus has nothing to do with grass or sparrows. Another one is apple pie order. It comes from the French napapli, which is folded napkin. So, folded napkin is tidy and precise. And when people heard that, they then, in their mind, it became apple pie order. So apple pie order has nothing to do with tidiness. Apple pies aren't particularly tidy, but it's called a folk etymology because the folk think it comes from somewhere where it doesn't. So that's not exactly what's going on here. False etymology I've never heard as a specific term, but I think things could have different origins. Like two different people came up with calculus at the same time, and other inventions sometimes spontaneously in more than one place. So I mean, it could be that it came up on the East Coast at one point and Midwest at one point, and in California at another point. People are debating over where the gay movement really started and Mattachine versus whatever. So, it could be spontaneous, and they could have had different origins in different places, and then they just sort of merged. I don't know. I mean, it's the problem with researching etymology is that this is even harder than most because it's gay slang, and slang by definition isn't written down. Is that Amy? Somehow Amy is on my screen now with her kids. So it's sort of doubly hard to track down written stuff in terms of the origin of it and the etymology of it. But I think what happens in the reference books is that people just copy each other the way on the web people just copy each other. And so when it looks like 10 different reference books mention this, it must be true. But if they list their sites, they're all citing the same earlier reference book.
So I have because we're coming right up at 8 o'clock, and I usually promise everyone we end around 8 so that you can have your second happy hour, your post-dinner drink. So this project, the book was published a couple years ago, and so this project seems to be sort of wrapped. What are you working on now? Or have you moved on to a new research project yet?
No, I don't really see myself as an author. This sort of came about because of the political challenge of the article, and then it turned into a book. I'm helping a woman write a biography of my mother, and I'm working on non-book projects. I'm writing up a history of my involvement in the Gay Task Force of the American Library Association. I had a lot of intense interactions with Barbara Giddings, who was the head of the Gay Task Force before me. In my effort to make it more democratic, I'm writing up something on that. It's not a book, it's more going to be an article that who knows how it's going to circulate. Because those are the things I'm working on now. Excellent. But wow. If anybody wants to get a copy of my book, Joan's going to post a link. I've got a website, www.dmichel.info, and it's got a sample chapter, lots of background information about me, about my book tour dates when they come back. I've got a blog with all sorts of interesting essays and stuff. So there's a lot to poke around on that website. And the front page of it has links for purchase both digitally and hard copy. And it doesn't have to be from Amazon. There's Barnes & Noble and other places you can get it from if you're not an Amazon fan.
Well, thank you. And I've put all of the links we've talked about in the chat tonight. Thank you so much, Dee, for your presentation, for answering our questions. We'll have to have you back after you see the Judy movie so that we can talk about it.
Jonathan.
That was great, Dee. Thanks so much. I really enjoyed that.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and so we will see you. Keep an eye on the History Project's email list on our Facebook and website and social media for more information about what we're doing while we can't meet in person. Pride Month is coming, so a lot of things are coming in Pride Month. I'm already tired, everyone. But I'm sure we will see you again soon. Thank you so much for being here tonight. And I hope you all have a wonderful evening and weekend.
Thank you. Bye.